It's week 7, and regardless of whether you're unbeaten and preparing for the playoffs or yet to get your first win, we've got you all set on the Waiver Wire show for week 7 on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. And whether you're having a good season or a bad one, I hope you're enjoying it. It's the Week 7 Waiver Wire show, and we're going to tell you all the best ads to improve your team as we hit the halfway point of the fantasy season. If you haven't already, it would be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. You can check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. That's where I release all my rankings first. Or you can find the full rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. They'll be coming out in the coming days. You can also check us out on Twitter at fantasyfirstdown with no O. And all of my articles are coming out on football.rasball.com. Nearly forgot that one. So let's get into the waiver wire ads for this week. And as always, we're breaking it down by position. We're starting things off with the quarterback. And Sam Darnold, well, he had a disappointing week 5 and then he went on bye. So it's easy to forget that he had an excellent first 4 weeks of the season, multiple touchdowns and good yardage in every game. And he gets his first really generous matchup against the Lions. This should be an absolute shootout. I really like him for this week. He is my favorite streaming quarterback. Caleb Williams is another good pickup. We saw how good he was last week. He was my favorite streamer last week, and he ended up being the QB1. He gets a bye, so a lot of people will be dropping him. Plus, if you watched our Streamers and Stashes show, hopefully you've got him on your roster anyway if you need a quarterback to pick up. Don't generally like having quarterbacks on my bench, but if you're going to stash someone, Williams probably has the most upside. Drake Bay is probably the best guy that you can get on waivers this week. He's 6% owned, and he looked solid last week. I guess this week he gets the best matchup for quarterbacks in football. It's the Jacksonville Jaguars. They have conceded the most points to quarterbacks so far this season, and I mean, at least May's throwing the ball enough to give you fantasy production as opposed to Jacoby Brissett. So that should elevate every pass catcher in that team as well. We talked about Challen Polk last week and how he might improve with May. But it was actually someone else who was the number 1 target, and we'll talk about that in the wide receiver pickups as well. Geno Smith's been very solid this season. He's the QB7. He does have seasons like this. Wasn't spectacular last week and gets an okay matchup against Atlanta. He's a solid pickup, and none of those other guys are available, but can't imagine there's many leagues where May isn't available, but Smith is. Maybe a dynasty league potentially. Now, with running backs, I'm breaking these up based on availability more than anything, and Rico Dowdle is my favorite. I've been talking about him basically since the start of the season. In fact, since the start of the preseason, realistically. I was getting him in the 4th round of rookie drafts at the start of this preseason. It's amazing how far we've come from them. He has been my favorite ad for as long as I can remember, and he's still available in a quarter of leagues, so pick him up if you're in a shallower league. He is going to be the starter moving forward, and that O-line is slowly starting to look a little bit functional, even though they looked diabolically bad last week against the Lions. Kareem Hunt, of course, a very good option, but the downside here, of course, is that Isaiah Pacheco probably comes back at some point in time. So if you're thinking playoffs, Hunt isn't going to help you very much in the distant future, but he's going to help you for now. So if he's a starter for now, he's going to be a good option for you. If he's more of a bench stash, don't really see the upside there, especially because we're also going to see Clyde Edwards-Helaire presumably come back at some point in time as well. Bucky Irving was good last week, but Sean Tucker was better. And that was a little bit of a weird one. So I'm not really sure what it's going to look like if Rashad White's out for another week. I do think there's a good chance that White is out, which means that Bucky Irving is probably going to give you solid production long term, but not this week against the Ravens. He's more of a guy I don't ideally want to start this week, more of a running back 3 option for me, but he is at least going to give you solid production. I don't know how much Tucker will see, but I do think Irving will be the main guy, especially on passing down, so didn't really see that a lot from Tucker. Tank Bigsby is another guy that's looking pretty solid. Travis Etienne should be out for a couple of weeks. Problem with Bigsby is he's basically only being used on early downs, and we're seeing Dearness Johnson being used on the passing downs. They fell behind early in the game in week 6, and that really hurt Bigsby because they didn't use him because they had Johnson out there just the whole time as they were chasing the game. It didn't matter the situation. They just used Johnson because they didn't want to be moving guys on and off. I expect that given their favorite against the Patriots, they'll probably be ahead. And in that case, Bigsby will get way more touches and be significantly more involved, plus should be back to being used on the goal line because Johnson wasn't particularly effective there anyway. So I think you'll get a couple of solid weeks out of Bigsby if you pick him up. Long term, neither of these guys are fantastic, but they're at least starting options for now. You're also going to get solid value out of Antonio Gibson. I think arguably he's probably a better start than, well, certainly Irving this week. Long term, not very good value. They're still using enough Hasty to be inconvenient. But Gibson did get plenty of touches last week, even though they fell behind very early and were ultimately chasing the game. This week against Jacksonville, well, everyone generally looks pretty solid against Jacksonville. They are slightly better against the run than the pass, but I still think Gibson's going to have a solid game. So he's a good guy to pick up and stream if you need a running back streamer this week in a moderate-sized league. Tyrone Tracy obviously has been excellent. And the thing I like most about Tracy is I do think he's going to start to earn a legitimate role even with Devin Singletary back. I expect Singletary's probably back this coming week, but the possibility is he's not. And if that happens, Tracy's going to be a useful option, even though it's not the greatest running matchup. But long-term, I think it is very possible we just see him split with Singletary long-term, and Tracy has some weekly value for that reason. Problem is, do you want a committee Giants running back? Maybe not. I think this is going to be a situation where neither Singletary nor Tracy has value. So if you can sell high on either of those guys, especially Singletary, I'd do it. But at least for now, if Tracy's the starter while Singletary's out, Tracy's going to have a lot of value, as we saw with his RB7 finish last week. Trey Sermon against Miami. I mean, this is a solid matchup. They should be ahead for most of this game, and that's good, but there is a good chance Jonathan Taylor's back. So while I like having Trey Sermon in my lineup, I think he is a good guy to have. We're seeing enough Tyler Goodson to be at least unfortunate. And while Sermon is the starter, the fact that Taylor's now healthy means he's someone you don't have to have on your roster. Ray Davis also has plenty of upside, but I think we probably see James Cook back this week. And it's not like that matchup against Tennessee is great. You can run against Tennessee relative to how much you can pass on them, but they're still like a top 12 running defense. They've just been good all round defensively, which is crazy. They were so bad against the pass last season, but they have been good against the run for a while. Davis looked absolutely fantastic on Monday Night Football. This is not a surprise to me. He was one of my favorite stashes going into the season. I had Braylon Allen, Tyler Algier, and Ray Davis as my top three guys. And they've all looked really good. And Ray Davis finally got the chance to show just how good he is. Finishes the RB14 without a touchdown, which is pretty crazy. He went for nearly 100 yards on the ground and looked okay through the air as well. You will still see some Ty Johnson, but this is always going to be Davis as the clear backup to Cook. So if Cook goes down again, Davis certainly has some value. Arguably could be ahead of guys like Sermon and Tracy if they're all starting. So certainly probably more upside than most of the guys in this range. I think probably more upside than everyone in this range, in fact. And finally, the true stashes, the guys that aren't starting this week, but at least have some upside moving forward and are available in the vast majority of leagues. These guys all have below 20% ownership. Tried to keep it a bit interesting this week. Was tempted to put in guys like Tyler Algier, who's 30% owned. He's obviously the best stash. That's not actually particularly useful week to week. And Ty Chandler could potentially be a starter this week, but I think Aaron Jones is probably back. And he also lacks the same upside because of how the Vikings use their running backs. But all of these guys are good, viable stashes. Blake Corum finally starts to look like he's taken over from Rodney Rivers as the backup. And that gives him massive upside because we know how good the running attack can be for the Rams. Kyron Williams is very effective and a good running back, but Blake Corum's good too. And if he gets the touches that Kyron's been getting, he's going to be, well, not so much a league winner, but certainly a very good option. Trey Benson started to take over from James Conner. Now, to be fair, Conner just looked a little bit knocked up. They were behind already. Conner wasn't really sparking as much. He hasn't been quite as effective this season, even though he's a very good running back. I'm not sure how much of that is the O-line and how much of that is Conner and just aging a little bit, but they started Benson in the second half and he provided a bit of a spark. They gave Conner another chance. He fumbled, so they just went back to Benson. I don't know if Conner's having some health issues or if they just decided this was a time to try the rookie out, but it could be that this is the time they're transitioning from Conner to Benson. So stashing Benson makes sense just in case that is the case. I still think that Benson's only an early down back, so he lacks the upside of most of the other stashes I've talked about, but I think he's more likely to have a job at the end of the season rather than most of these other guys. Problem is, if Connor's healthy, I don't know that you're ever going to see no Connor, and I think that awkward committee situation is enough to steer me away from Benson. Kamani Vidal got the opportunity with Gus Edwards going onto IR, and he looked good. Broke off some solid plays, had that big receiving touchdown. But I mean, this is still J.K. Dobbins' backfield. It's not like the committee it was with Edwards. Vidal is very much a handcuff, but he at least has a little bit of upside. A lot of people were talking about him in the preseason. He was never going to be the starter, but he's at least put himself in a position to have some value. And most people have dropped him that picked him up in the preseason. So you can pick him up if you're someone that interests you, especially in a very deep league. And Isaac Correndo, this is an awkward situation. CMC is going to come back. Jordan Mason looks like he'll probably play this week anyway. It's just a shoulder issue. So I don't know that Correndo has that much value, but I mean, he at least looked okay. Broke off one big run when given the opportunity. So you can pick him up if you're in a super deep league and you really need something on your bench. He at least has some upside. Wide receivers, and Cortland Sutton's been dropped in a lot of leagues, and he looked pretty solid. They're starting to pass the ball a little bit more effectively with Bo Nix. Sutton's clearly their number one guy, so he's someone you can pick up in a shallow league if you just need a starter who's going to give you okay production. He's a wide receiver 3, essentially. The wide receiver 3 literally is the lowest of the wide receiver 3s, 36 overall this season. Khalil Shakir, obviously been battling injury, but he's still a great guy to stash on your bench. He's the number one passing option in this offense alongside Dalton Kincaid. To be fair, this offense doesn't really pass a lot. It's a lot of Josh Allen running and a lot of random checkdowns and James Cook rushing and all this other rubbish going on. But Shakir is probably their best passing catching option, certainly their best wide receiver option. Is Curtis Samuel going to get more involved after the last couple of weeks? I don't think so. He didn't look fantastic. I still think Shakir is their number one guy, but it's an awkward situation. You definitely can't start him this week against Tennessee, especially when he's not running most routes and was hardly involved this week. I don't feel great about Shakir for the near future, but long term, I do think he's someone who can provide some value. Lam McConkey, same situation, capped upside. They actually at least passed a little bit more this week, but it's not like they looked fantastic doing it. I do think the run game is still going to be their bread and butter. So I do think that McConkey is going to be limited for that reason. I don't think you're going to get much more out of him than you're getting already. Just like a lot of underneath targets, maybe 50 yards and 6 catches is going to be his kind of like solid weeks. So for that reason, unless you're in a PPR league that's pretty deep, he's not someone that you really need. He's just a solid option. Wanda Robinson I like a lot, even if Malik Neighbors comes back. But this week, I think he's still a solid option. When Neighbors comes back, he drops in value a little bit. At least Shakir and McConkey are the number ones for their teams, and Sutton. Robinson's not that, but he probably has more upside than all these guys, especially in PPR. He's a very good option. I think there's an argument you can put him ahead of any of these guys, depending on your situation. It really depends on what you're looking for. But in a PPR league where you're just trying to get solid weekly production, I think Robinson is a good option. And it always has the upside of Neighbors potentially being out at any time. And then he's going to get a jump. I don't know that any of those other 3 guys are going to get a bump by someone else's injury. Some slightly deeper options, but arguably better options, I think. Josh Downs available in over half of leagues, but he's got a heap of upside. The problem is if Anthony Richardson comes in, is he going to use Downs? Is he going to use Pittman? Is he going to use neither? I think probably neither, and that's my fear here, but there's still so much upside with Josh Downs. Do I want to start him against Miami? Not particularly, but I certainly want him on my bench because the upside is huge. Alan Lazard, amazingly, wide receiver 8 on the season. That's just so strange to me. I don't know really what's happening here. I think it's partly being the slot guy and the fact that Aaron Rodgers loves him. But remember, this is a guy who last season was being made a healthy inactive by this same team. It's super strange. I don't really know what's going on here, but look, he's certainly someone you can pick up and use, especially in a slightly deeper league. I mean, wide receiver 8, that's really all I need to say. Juju Smith-Schuster, we talked about last week. I think there's better guys ahead of him there. I think Downs and Lazard have kind of proven they've got more clear roles, but Juju could still be very good. I think there's a heap of upside here. Xavier Worthy's still that deep guy. I do think that you're going... Rashee Rice definitely being out for the season now, or near certainly being out for the season, really helps Juju as well. So, I don't know. There's not a lot of target competition. Justin Watson's going to be out there, but he runs a lot of empty routes and blocks a lot. So, it's just a case of how much Mecole Hardman do we see? How much Sky Moore do we see? All those guys they like to bring in for a few snaps. Is that going to affect Juju or someone else? That's really my only concern here. I do think he's got a heap of upside. Problem is we've only seen it for 1 week. These other guys, we've seen it for longer. That's why I've got him ranked higher. Romeo Dobbs was a top 10 wide receiver last week. He's the only guy that's consistently playing on every down. We did see Jaden Reed finally get involved in 12 personnel last week, only for a couple of snaps, admittedly. But for the most part, he is off, and they play Dobbs and either Wicks or Watson. It has been like Watson about 60 to 70% and Wicks the rest of the time. But this week we started to see more Wicks. I don't know if that's because Watson's coming back from injury, but then Wicks got injured and suddenly Watson was the every down starter. I thought about having Watson as a waiver option, but I think Wicks is probably going to be healthy for this week. And even if he's not, it's just a 1 week thing. Dobbs, at least, is going to keep being that guy. Now, that guy is not worth a lot, but at least it's worth something if you're in a deeper league. So he's someone who's going to be out there in a pass-heavy offense. There's always touchdown upside. He may re-establish himself as a clear option, but I do think Christian Watson has more upside, especially if Wicks gets injured long-term. Super deep options, Michael Wilson. Sorry, that's the only picture of him I could find that was an actual proper headshot picture. For some reason, I just could not find them where I usually find the pictures, so had to make do with that. Michael Wilson, the clear number one guy with Marvin Harrison out due to a concussion. How much value does that have? Probably not very much, especially against the Chargers, but better than nothing. In a super deep league, and he's available in most leagues, he is probably the best you're going to find. So he's a solid guy you can pick up and use. Xavier Weaver is the other backup to Harrison. Now, I think Harrison probably only misses a week or maybe 2. And I don't think you can start Weaver without seeing 1 more week to make sure that with a week of preparation, they don't do something differently. But if you're in the deepest of leagues, Weaver is a viable pickup. I'm in some 32-team leagues. Weaver definitely should be on rosters there, and I'll probably get him if someone else doesn't. Xavier Leggett, you've heard me talk about him a lot if you've been listening to the channel since the start of the preseason. Love this guy. So good last season in college. Finally starting to show out here, getting some touchdowns more often, but still kind of establishing himself. Gets a good matchup this week against Washington. My concern is what happens when Adam Thielen comes back. I don't know what this offense is going to look like. Are we still seeing Leggett and Mingo kind of split a role in that case? I think there's enough risk there that I put him below Wilson, but still a very solid option and could establish himself behind Deontay Johnson, who's the true number one here. Demario Douglas is the guy that Drake May really latched onto. I believe he had 8 targets, was top 10 in the end. Still going to have limited upside as a guy who really only plays in 11 personnel, but solid player. We've seen him do well at times. I do think we'll probably see more Polk in different matchups, but this week against Jacksonville, Douglas is a very viable streamer. I think he could be good this week. And Troy Franklin finally got a starting role. He slowly had his snaps building as the weeks have gone on. Josh Reynolds being injured certainly helps, but he kind of moved ahead of Lil John Humphrey as well. In fact, we saw Devon Vele finally come back in. He started in week 1 and then was injured and then became a healthy and active. Then kind of started playing a little bit more and then became a starter again alongside Sutton and Franklin. So I think that when Reynolds comes back, that probably hurts Vele, but I think Franklin is probably going to establish himself as that wide receiver 2 long-term, maybe the wide receiver 3. That gives him a little upside. He's available in the vast majority of leagues, which is funny given how excited people were about him in the preseason. I still think it's the Broncos. This is limited upside. You have to be in a very deep league to want to start a lower end Broncos guy. And I still think he's going to lose some stats to guys like Humphrey and Reynolds and whoever else, Vele, whoever else they're cycling through. But he is a viable option if you need a deeper stash. Tight ends. Cole Kmet, tight end 1 on the week. He was my favorite streamer, so celebrating that call. And he's the number 3 on the season, available in a lot of leagues. The problem is he's just had 2 boom weeks and not done much other than that. With how many pass catching options they have, I don't know that you can actually trust him, but the tight end landscape is real sparse. So based on who's out there, I think he's a viable option. David Njoku is another guy I like the idea of. Is available in a solid amount of leagues, and especially after last week, might even be available in more. I think he's still coming back from injury. He did play most snaps, but they weren't really using him properly. I think he had 7 targets for 5 catches, but wasn't really able to use them. I think there are going to be matchups where he's a lot better moving forward. Dalton Schultz really benefiting from Brevin Jordan being injured. Now he's getting a lot more routes. Plus, having Nico Collins out is definitely helping him too, because there are more targets to go around. So I do think that we'll see more from Schultz. Had a end zone target that he could not catch this week, but that at least shows that he's going to be part of this offense. I think he's a solid option, especially this week against Green Bay. He's a good streaming option. And don't forget TJ Hawkinson. He should be back at some stage. I would expect in the next month or so. So Obviously, if you've got an IR spot, someone's got him on their IR spot. But if you don't, you might find that you can pick him up and stash him on your bench, given how difficult it is to find tight ends at the moment. And given it's not like Johnny Munt or Josh Oliver have been great. Hawkinson's clearly going to come in and be the main guy long term. Evan Ingram and Tucker Kraft still available in like a quarter of leagues. They're obviously fantastic pickups. They're probably going to be top 5 ranked this week. So go and get them if they're available in your league. And if they're not, have a look at one of these guys. If none of these guys are available, I'm sorry. Hopefully you've got somebody, because there's not really that many good options out there. The one thing I do want to mention, Mark Andrews, people are excited after last week. He's not being used differently. They've had a really tough start to the season, and they've tried to use him in those games where it's been tight, but they've got a really easy run of games coming up. I don't think you'll see a lot of Andrews, and probably not a lot of Likely either. So neither of those guys particularly interest me in fantasy at the moment. Kickers and DSTs, Austin Seibert, number 5 for the season, has only missed 1 kick all season, 15 from 15 in extra points, 15 from 16 in field goals. So fantastic option. Takes on Carolina this week. You know I love streaming kickers going against Carolina. Jason Myers against Atlanta. I talk about players playing against Atlanta as well. They are the best matchup for kickers. Even Eddie Pinheiro last week managed to score 9 points against Atlanta. That's his best of the season. Jason Myers, great kicker. Hasn't been used enough this season, but against Atlanta, he will be. DSTs, funnily enough, teams playing against each other. The Broncos against the Saints. Broncos have struggled to move the ball a little bit, so that's why I like the Saints. Saints are a top 8 DST this season, and they're available in a lot of leagues. Broncos available in less leagues, but I love their matchup. If you can get them, definitely do it. I'll probably rank them number 1. Spencer Rattler was a turnover machine. The Broncos defense is very good. They're 4th on the season. Looks like Chris Olave is injured. Looks like Rashid Shaheed's injured. That's not to say they'll all be out, but look, how are the Saints going to do anything next week? I really don't see it happening. It's probably going to be a lot of Alvin Kamara. Broncos should be able to shut that down, should be able to create a lot of turnovers or pressures. That's going to be great for DST production. So really like the Broncos DST this week. That's all we've got for the Waiver Wire show for week 7. Hope you enjoyed that. If you did, hope you'll hit the like and subscribe button so you can check out all the good content we're coming up this week in the next day or two. I'll have my Streamers and Stashes show. Then we'll go on and have the Start Sit show on Saturday. You can also check out my articles over at football.razzball.com. I do a Streamers and Stashes article, which should be out tomorrow, based on, depending on when you listen to this, tomorrow for me, certainly. And then a couple of days after that, I do a slot versus wide analysis for wide receivers, telling you the best starts and sits for wide receivers. I'll go through that a little bit more on the Saturday start and sit show. You can check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. And my rankings will be up at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Look forward to seeing you guys next week.